We constantly guess what the future will look like, but we rarely ask how it will be funded. Let's run the numbers. Today we examine the persistent mystery of energy pricing on a green grid. Many observers assume that transition to wind, solar, and water power means electricity could eventually become free. After all, sunlight and wind carry no fuel cost, suggesting infinite abundance for most actors. This assumption underpins many technological forecasts. But does fuel abundance actually eliminate the cost of electricity? The physical assets required to harness and distribute energy suggest a very different economic reality. Under this assumption, we must look beyond generation to the complete structure of power delivery. We can discover that even when fuel is free, the grid itself remains a deeply constrained resource. We can explore the economic mechanisms that govern electricity supply when weather conditions change. This analysis reveals why pricing structures do not simply fall to zero even under high renewable adoption rates. The central question is not whether we can build a clean grid, but how we allocate power when supply drops. The answer lies in the fundamental principles of resource allocation. A renewable grid is inherently variable, relying on weather patterns that humans cannot control. This variability introduces sudden periods of scarcity, where demand for electricity exceeds available generation capacity significantly. During these periods of scarcity, a grid must make critical allocation decisions. It comes down to scarcity. Without fuel-based plants to ramp up, we cannot simply produce more power on demand. If we do not allocate scarce power efficiently, the grid faces physical collapse. Blackouts represent an unmanaged rationing mechanism, imposing very severe economic costs on households and vital industrial sectors. Therefore, we must design mechanisms to allocate available power during supply deficits. The opportunity cost of electricity rises dramatically when supply is low, requiring us to prioritize high-value uses over others. Every unit of power directed to one factory is a unit denied to another. This trade-off is the core problem of a green economy, where energy availability fluctuates hour by hour. To understand how societies can manage this variability, we must analyze the economic tools of rationing. We must examine who gets power, who pays, and who loses during calm, cloudy days. We begin by distinguishing between the marginal cost and system cost. The marginal cost of solar generation is indeed near zero, as capturing extra sunlight requires no additional fuel purchases. However, the system cost of reliability remains high. Ensuring power is available every second requires building redundant generation, long-distance transmission lines, and massive storage installations to handle seasonal weather shifts. These capital investments must be recovered through electricity tariffs. Even if generation is free, consumers must pay for the physical network that delivers power and stabilizes grid frequency during fluctuations. Furthermore, we must define economic rationing. In economics, rationing refers to any mechanism that allocates a scarce resource among competing demands. It does not imply government control or food lines. Market prices are the most common rationing mechanism in market economies. When demand exceeds supply, prices rise, incentivizing consumers to reduce consumption and resource owners to increase supply where possible. But electricity is a unique commodity. It must be consumed the instant it is generated, and storage, while improving, remains constrained by thermodynamics, material availability, and strict capital cost limits. This severe instantaneous requirement means that when supply falls, the rationing mechanism must act immediately. We cannot wait for markets to slowly adjust over weeks. Allocation must occur in milliseconds. With these definitions established, we can analyze the specific allocation mechanisms available to a renewable grid. We can trace the causal chain of price signals, capacity markets, and administrative controls. Under this scenario, the primary mechanism for managing renewable variability is dynamic pricing. As solar output drops in the evening, wholesale electricity prices rise, signaling scarcity to the energy market. Dynamic pricing attempts to ration power by shifting consumer behavior. High prices encourage industrial users to pause operations, while smart appliances in homes automatically reduce consumption to avoid high costs. This is a price-based rationing system. It relies on the fundamental price elasticity of demand. assuming that users would voluntarily reduce consumption if the cost of electricity becomes sufficiently high. Interestingly, not all consumers can react to price signals. A hospital cannot easily turn off its machines, meaning its demand is highly inelastic, while a data center might shift workloads. This difference in elasticity creates significant distributional consequences. Inelastic users bear the heavy financial burden of high prices, while elastic users avoid costs by shifting their consumption to cheaper periods. A second mechanism is capacity payments. Under this model, grid operators pay generator owners simply to maintain standby capacity, ensuring backup power remains available when renewable generation suddenly falls. Capacity payments represent a hedge against scarcity, paid for by all consumers through flat fees. This shift moves the cost burden from volatile spot prices to stable long-term infrastructure charges. Follow the incentive structure. If backup generators are paid just to remain idle, they have little incentive to optimize efficiency, potentially raising the overall cost of grid reliability for consumers. A third allocation mechanism is administrative rationing. When price signals fail to balance the grid, operators must manually disconnect loads, selecting which specific geographic regions or sectors lose power first. Administrative rationing bypasses market prices largely, relying on regulatory priorities instead. Grid operators protect critical infrastructure like water treatment plants while cutting power to residential neighborhoods during severe energy deficits. This manual allocation represents a clear opportunity cost. The economic value lost by a dark factory may be far greater than the cost of keeping residential air conditioning running continuously. Yet, grid operators must prioritize system stability over economic optimization. A total grid failure is often far more expensive than targeted rolling blackouts, forcing operators to make crude allocation choices. We see that even a green grid cannot escape fundamental trade-offs. The abundance of wind and sunlight does not remove the physical constraints of transmission capacity and instantaneous demand balance. Therefore, the final retail cost of electricity on a renewable grid is determined by the cost of managing scarcity, not the zero marginal cost of harvesting wind or solar resources. This economic mechanism clearly explains why transition to clean energy does not guarantee cheap power. The capital costs of stabilization and allocation mechanisms place a solid floor under utility prices. To validate this thesis, we must first explore when these allocation trade-offs might not apply. Under this assumption, we analyze potential boundary conditions that could alter our final economic conclusion. One common counterpoint suggests that massive overbuilding of renewable generation could eliminate scarcity. By constructing 5 times the required capacity, we might generate enough power even on calm, cloudy days. However, this overbuilding approach faces a very clear capital constraint. Overbuilding requires immense upfront investment, creating a substantial system cost that consumers must pay, thereby failing to make electricity free. A second counterpoint relies on battery storage. If battery costs decline to near zero, we could easily store summer solar energy for winter use, removing the need for real-time rationing. This scenario represents a failed assumption. Material limits, degradation, and manufacturing constraints make infinite free storage highly improbable, meaning resource allocation choices remain necessary for the foreseeable future. A highly viable alternative equilibrium involves dynamic demand-side management. Instead of rationing supply, smart grids could automatically coordinate consumption, turning off water heaters and electric vehicle chargers during peak scarcity events. This decentralization shifts the rationing burden from prices or blackouts to automated software. While this stabilizes the grid, it still requires significant infrastructure investment, maintaining high overall system costs throughout. We can now resolve our opening question. Renewable energy does not make electricity free because capturing free fuel typically requires expensive physical capital assets that must be maintained and allocated. Here is the constraint: we cannot bypass the rigid physical laws of transmission and the economic laws of opportunity cost. A renewable grid simply trades fuel scarcity for capital scarcity. Instead of paying for coal or gas, consumers are likely to pay for batteries, high voltage lines, and smart grid software. The pricing structure shifts from variable operating costs to fixed capital charges. This structural shift directly changes how utility companies design their retail tariffs. Fixed daily connection fees may rise significantly, while volumetric rates could fluctuate wildly based on real-time weather conditions. Wealthier consumers who can invest in local battery storage or solar generation tend to hedge against this volatility, while low-income households may face much higher relative costs during peak allocation events. Ultimately, scarcity sets the price. As long as transmission capacity and storage remain finite, energy cannot be distributed without allocation decisions, ensuring retail prices reflect the true cost of grid reliability. This resolution highlights the clear limits of technological optimism. Free input resources do not translate to free consumer products when the intermediate distribution and transformation process requires scarce physical capital assets. We must view the green transition not as an escape from limits, but as a relocation of constraints. We are moving from resource extraction limits to engineering and capital limits. Understanding this distinction allows us to design much better public energy policies. We can move past empty promises of energy abundance and focus instead on structuring efficient, equitable rationing mechanisms. To apply this analysis, we must evaluate how current grid policies structure incentives for peak load management and capital recovery. We must ask who pays, who benefits, and who bears the risk. If we underprice reliability, we invite severe underinvestment in backup systems, leading to more frequent administrative blackouts and higher long-term economic damage across the entire grid. Conversely, if we overprice peak power, we risk placing an unsustainable financial burden on inelastic consumers who cannot easily adjust their consumption patterns during sudden scarcity events. We must design robust regulatory frameworks that encourage private investment in flexible demand systems, allowing consumers to participate directly in grid balancing through automated responses. This decentralized approach successfully aligns private incentives with overall public grid stability, significantly reducing the necessity for centralized administrative rationing and rolling blackouts during severe weather-driven energy deficits. Analysts must very carefully test these systematic economic scenarios under different storage cost projections, adjusting our collective expectations of future retail price volatility and overall system reliability accordingly. By separating engineering feasibility from economic sustainability, we can build a highly realistic and exceptionally durable roadmap for the future green energy transition without relying on unrealistic assumptions. Our primary analytical focus must remain on the incentives that drive capital allocation, rather than assuming new technology automatically solves all major distribution trade-offs and resource constraints in the future. A renewable grid is a triumph of engineering, but its survival depends on how we manage the scarcity of reliability. The future is just incentives at scale. See you tomorrow.